Let's get straight to it. Identity politics, the phrase alone, is enough to spark heated debates, passionate defenses, and outright hostility. Depending on who you talk to, it's either the key to justice and representation or the source of endless division. But what does it really mean? And why has it become such a hotly contested issue? At its core, identity politics is about people coming together based on shared aspects of their identity like race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, or social class to advocate for their rights, their representation, and their recognition in society. It's not a new concept. History is full of examples of people organizing around shared identities to push for change. The civil rights movement, women's suffrage, LGBTQ activism, all of these are rooted in identity politics. Here's why it's so important. For much of history, certain identities were ignored, marginalized, or outright oppressed. Identity politics emerged as a way to fight back. It's about saying we exist and we deserve a voice. It's about addressing systemic injustices that can't be solved by pretending everyone's experience is the same. Because let's be real, not everyone starts from the same place. Some people face barriers and biases that others don't, and identity politics shines a light on those realities. But here's where it gets complicated. While identity politics can unite people within a group, it can also create friction between groups or even within them. Think about it. When people focus on their own identities, it's easy to fall into an us vs. them mindset. That's not necessarily intentional, but it happens. One group's fight for recognition can feel like a threat to another group's status or values. And when that tension isn't addressed, it can lead to polarization. This is where the criticism comes in. Some argue that identity politics divides us more than it unites us. They say it encourages people to see themselves primarily as members of a group rather than as individuals or part of a larger society. Others claim it's overly focused on grievances, leading to endless conflict instead of meaningful solutions. But is that really the fault of identity politics, or is it a symptom of deeper issues in society?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Let's break this down further. At its best, identity politics is about inclusion. It's about making space for everyone to be seen and heard, especially those who've been left out for far too long. But at its worst, it can lead to gatekeeping, deciding who does or doesn't belong based on rigid definitions of identity. For example, in feminist movements, there's been debate over whose voices should take priority: women of color, LGBTQ women, working class women. When identity politics becomes too narrow, it risks excluding the very people it aims to uplift. But there's another layer to this. Identity politics isn't just about personal identity, it's also about power. Who has it, who doesn't, and how it's distributed. When people talk about systemic racism, patriarchy, or economic inequality, they're talking about systems that benefit some identities at the expense of others. Identity politics challenges those systems by demanding fairness, equity, and accountability. But challenging power isn't easy, it's uncomfortable, and it often sparks backlash. Now let's bring this closer to home. How does identity politics play out in your life? Maybe you've been part of a movement that gave you a sense of belonging and purpose. Or maybe you felt left out, like your identity wasn't fully understood or valued. Either way, identity politics is likely shaping your world in ways you might not even realize, from the media you consume to the policies that affect your daily life. Let's get straight to the heart of why identity politics is so divisive. For some people, it represents empowerment, the ability to speak up, claim space, and demand justice for marginalized groups. For others, it feels like a threat, a fracturing of unity, or a zero-sum game where one group's gain means another's loss. So what makes this concept so polarizing? And is it possible for identity politics to unite people without creating deeper divisions? First, let's talk about how identity politics challenges the status quo. Every society has norms, unspoken rules about whose voices are loudest and whose experiences are considered universal. Identity politics disrupts that by saying, wait a second, your universal isn't everyone's experience. Let's talk about the people who've been left out. And that's uncomfortable for those who've benefited from the way things are. Here's a simple example: representation in media. For decades, most mainstream movies and TV shows featured white, straight, able-bodied men as the default protagonists. Identity politics pushed back, demanding more diverse stories. And while that's been transformative for many, it's also sparked backlash. Some people see increased representation as a loss of their own cultural dominance, even though it's really just making room for others. But the tension isn't always between different groups. Sometimes it's within the same group. Take movements for racial justice. Within these movements, there are debates about whose struggles should take priority: Black women, Black LGBTQ people, or Black men. These debates can feel divisive, but they're also a reminder of how complex identity is. No one fits neatly into a single category. Intersectionality, the idea that people experience oppression differently based on overlapping identities, makes identity politics more inclusive, but it also makes it harder to build consensus. Now let's talk about the backlash against identity politics. One of the biggest criticisms is that it's too divisive. Critics argue that focusing on what makes us different, our race, gender, or sexuality, takes away from what unites us as human beings. They say we should prioritize shared values or a common national identity instead. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. Who doesn't want unity? But here's the problem: calls for unity often ignore power dynamics. They assume everyone starts from the same place, with the same opportunities. Identity politics says that's not true. Unity can't mean erasing differences or pretending they don't matter. It has to mean addressing inequality so that everyone can genuinely feel included. Otherwise, unity becomes a way to silence people who are asking for change. Another criticism is that identity politics fuels tribalism, the idea that people retreat into their own groups and stop caring about anyone else. And yes, that can happen. But is that a flaw of identity politics, or is it a reflection of human nature? After all, we've seen tribalism in politics, sports, religion, and countless other areas long before the term identity politics even existed. The real question is whether identity politics can help us move beyond tribalism by creating space for genuine dialogue and mutual understanding. Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about language. Identity politics often brings new terms and concepts into public discourse, words like microaggressions, privilege, and systemic oppression. For people within marginalized groups, these terms can be empowering, giving them language to describe their experiences. But for others, they can feel alienating or even accusatory. Think about the phrase, check your privilege. It's not meant to attack, it's meant to encourage reflection. But when people hear it as blame, it shuts down conversation instead of opening it up. This brings us to one of the biggest challenges of identity politics: communication. How do you advocate for change without alienating people who don't fully understand the issues? How do you make space for marginalized voices without creating an USVS? Them dynamic. These aren't easy questions, but they're crucial if identity politics is going to lead to meaningful progress. Here's another layer to consider: the role of power. Identity politics isn't just about saying, "I'm proud of who I am." It's about demanding power, political, economic, and cultural. And power is always contested. When one group gains power, another might feel like they're losing it. That's why identity politics often feels so high stakes. It's not just about representation or recognition, it's about who gets to shape the future. But let's not ignore the positives. Identity politics has brought real change. It's helped dismantle discriminatory laws, increase representation, and amplify voices that were once ignored. It's created movements that have transformed societies. The fact that we're even having these conversations shows how much progress has been made. The challenge now is figuring out how to build on that progress without falling into endless conflict. Let's face it, identity politics isn't going anywhere. It's become too deeply embedded in the way people think about justice, representation, and power. But the real question is, where does it go from here? How can it evolve to address its challenges without losing its core purpose? And perhaps most importantly, how can it create solutions instead of endless arguments? First, let's talk about the potential of identity politics to build bridges. At its best, it's not about division, it's about empathy. It's about helping people understand perspectives they might never have considered. Think about the stories that have come out of movements for racial justice, LGBTQ rights, and disability advocacy. These aren't just political talking points, they're deeply personal experiences that challenge assumptions and expand understanding. Identity politics shines when it makes room for these stories to be heard and respected. But here's the catch: for empathy to work, there has to be dialogue. And that's where identity politics sometimes stumbles. When discussions turn into battles over who's more oppressed or whose grievances are more valid, it shuts people down instead of bringing them in. The truth is, oppression isn't a competition. Different struggles can coexist without invalidating each other. The challenge is creating a space where those differences are acknowledged without overshadowing the shared goal of justice. Next, let's consider how identity politics can move beyond just highlighting problems to actually driving solutions. Calling out injustice is important. It raises awareness and demands accountability. But it's only the first step. The next step is finding ways to address those injustices in a way that brings people together. For example, instead of framing conversations around what one group stands to lose, they could be framed around what everyone gains when society becomes more equitable. Take workplace diversity as an example. It's not just about checking boxes or meeting quotas. It's about creating environments where people from all backgrounds can thrive and bring their unique perspectives to the table. When framed this way, diversity becomes less about competition and more about collaboration, about building something better together. Now let's tackle the role of leadership in identity politics. Movements thrive or falter based on their leaders. The best leaders understand how to navigate the complexities of identity politics, balancing the need for representation with the need for unity. They know how to call out injustice without alienating potential allies. And they're not afraid to have difficult conversations, not just with opponents, but within their own movements. Strong leadership is about keeping the focus on the bigger picture: justice, equality, and the well-being of everyone involved. Here's another layer to consider: the role of intersectionality. If identity politics is going to evolve, it has to embrace the fact that people's identities are multifaceted. A Black woman's experience is different from that of a Black man or a white woman. A disabled LGBTQ person faces challenges that are unique to their intersection of identities. Intersectionality makes identity politics more inclusive, but it also makes it more complex. The challenge is ensuring that this complexity doesn't become a barrier to action. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room: the media. Identity politics often gets distorted in public discourse, turned into clickbait headlines or polarizing sound bites. This fuels misunderstanding and backlash, making it harder for meaningful conversations to happen. The solution? Movements and individuals need to take control of the narrative. That means focusing on the stories and solutions that unite rather than the controversies that divide. It means emphasizing shared humanity, even while addressing systemic differences. So where does all of this leave us? It leaves us with the realization that identity politics isn't inherently good or bad. It's a tool. Like any tool, its impact depends on how it's used. It can be a force for justice, empowerment, and understanding. Or it can be a source of division and frustration. The choice is ours. Let's end with a challenge. What would it look like to practice identity politics in a way that builds bridges without losing the fight for justice? Can we celebrate our differences while working toward common goals? Can we listen to each other's stories without turning them into competition? If we can answer those questions, then identity politics has the potential to be one of the most powerful forces for good in the modern world. And that's something worth fighting for. Let's push this conversation further. Identity politics is often framed as a conflict between groups, between ideologies, between the individual and the collective. But does it have to be? What if instead of conflict, we focused on the opportunities it creates? Opportunities to rethink power, rebuild systems, and redefine what justice means in the modern world. One of the most important things identity politics does is force us to confront inequality in all its forms. It doesn't let us look away from the systemic barriers that some people face. But recognition isn't enough. The question is, what do we do about it? How do we take these insights and translate them into action? That's the real test for identity politics, whether it can move beyond calling out problems to driving meaningful change. And that starts with redefining power. Traditionally, power has been seen as a zero-sum game. If one group gains, another loses. But what if that's not true? What if power is more like a resource we can grow, something that expands as more people have access to it? Identity politics challenges us to think about power differently, not as something to hoard, but as something to share. That means creating systems where everyone can participate fully, not just those who've historically had the advantage. Take economic inequality, for example. Identity politics highlights how race, gender, and other factors influence access to wealth and opportunity. But instead of stopping there, it can also drive solutions policies that close wage gaps, expand access to education, and ensure fair treatment in the workplace. These aren't just wins for specific groups, they're wins for society as a whole, because inequality hurts everyone. The same applies to representation. When marginalized groups gain a voice in politics, media, and decision-making, they bring perspectives that have been missing. That leads to better outcomes for everyone. Diverse leadership isn't just about fairness, it's about effectiveness. It means decisions are informed by a wider range of experiences, making them more thoughtful and inclusive. But there's a flip side to this responsibility. With greater representation comes the responsibility to build coalitions, to engage with people who don't share your perspective, and to work towards solutions that benefit the broader community. That's where identity politics sometimes hits roadblocks. If it becomes too focused on specific grievances or too rigid in its boundaries, it risks alienating potential allies. And let's be honest, real change requires allies. No movement succeeds in isolation. This brings us to the role of dialogue. Identity politics often thrives on calling out injustice, but it also needs to make space for conversation, real conversation, where people listen as much as they speak. That doesn't mean compromising on core values. It means recognizing that not everyone starts from the same place of understanding, and that building bridges takes patience and effort. Let's not forget about education either. So much of the backlash against identity politics comes from misunderstanding or fear. When people don't understand concepts like privilege or systemic inequality, they're more likely to see them as personal attacks. Education, whether through schools, media, or community initiatives, can help bridge that gap. It's not about shaming people for what they don't know. It's about equipping them with the tools to see the world more clearly and engage with it more thoughtfully. And then there's the question of unity. Is it possible to practice identity politics in a way that strengthens our sense of shared humanity? The answer has to be yes, because the alternative is division. But unity doesn't mean erasing differences or pretending they don't matter. It means finding common ground without ignoring the unique struggles that different groups face. It means recognizing that justice for one group doesn't come at the expense of another. It's part of building a fairer world for everyone. So what does the future of identity politics look like? It looks like collaboration. It looks like movements that center marginalized voices without excluding others. It looks like policies that address inequality while fostering shared responsibility. And it looks like a society where differences are celebrated, not as sources of conflict, but as sources of strength. Let's leave it here. Identity politics is a tool. It can divide, or it can unite. It can stagnate in grievances, or it can spark transformative action. The choice isn't just up to the activists, the leaders, or the critics. It's up to all of us. How we engage, how we listen, and how we act will determine whether identity politics becomes a force for division or the catalyst for a more just and equitable world.